Matthew, everyday audiophile, music lover, and as always, beer enthusiast. Now, before we get started, I have to apologize. In my last video, I did say that was a beer from the Ozarks, and I was mistaken on that one. It was actually from Seattle. The beer today is the one from the Ozarks. But without any further ado, this is the Gotta Hold Brewing Cicatrix IPA. And this one is definitely from the Ozarks. So, this video today has been a long time coming. If you recall a few videos ago, I unboxed the LHY SW10 Pro network switch. And I'll be honest, I have a lot of misgivings about network gear in general. It's pretty good. So, being a software engineer, being a network engineer, I understand the core concepts of networking and why networking shouldn't make a difference in audio quality. But that being said, I've been told by other members of the group that I'm in that yes, they do indeed make a difference, and it's not about the perfectness of the ones and zeros that you get from the switch, but more so about the noise that could be on that cable as the data is being delivered. And it took me a second to think about this. Does that statement actually hold water? Does it actually make sense? And I guess at a theoretical level, if you're talking about just the electrical noise on a cable, it does make sense, but I'll still admit I am very skeptical. Probably need someone even smarter than me to explain why I'm hearing what I'm hearing, which we'll go over in this video. So for those that didn't watch the previous video, this is the SW10 Pro. It is a beast. It is pretty large. It weighs a good deal. It has nice feet on the bottom that I'll probably end up replacing, to be honest. And a good deal of ports on the back. We can talk about these one more time. So the ones right here, these are the data section. These are 2.5 gig ports with one 10 gig SFP plus port. On the audio side, these are two 1 gig ports with one 1 gig SFP. The two sections are connected to each other via SFP, so internally you can basically think of this as two switches that are then connected to each other via a single 1 gig SFP link. Additionally, there is two 10 megahertz master clock outputs. This has a highly specified master clock inside that it uses to clock both of the network sections, and then you can clock the output devices that go to your DAC or any other pieces as you see fit. I haven't gotten anything yet to test this bit, so that's going to be a future video. This video is going to be purely about this switch as it stands without any other connections. How does this sound in my system? It doesn't make a difference, and is it worth the asking price of $2,400 before import fees into the US? Before we talk about that switch, let's talk about what I've been using prior. And it's right over here. Let me go get it. Yeah. Compare the mighty LHY switch to this. My TP-Link Gigabit 5-port switch. I've been using this for the last 5 years at least, and I've never really given it a second thought. I will admit that I was using it with a linear power supply. Whether or not that made a difference, it was just one of those might as well. I never really tested the before and after, so I can't speak to whether the linear power supply with this actually made a difference. But it always functioned flawlessly, and like I said, being a network engineer, to me, any switch is the perfect switch as long as it gets your data from point A to point B without any errors. Before I talk about my thoughts on how this switch sounded, let's talk about the testing strategy. How did I go about testing not only this switch compared to the LHY, but also plugging the network streamer into just the data side of the switch by itself? So there's really a three-way comparison going on here. It's cheap switch to expensive switch, data side only, and then expensive switch data side to audio side using that fiber media converter, the SFP. As far as testing is concerned, what I would do is plug everything into this, listen to 30 seconds, and with the assistance of my lovely wife, switch from this to this. I gave her instructions on what cable to plug into from here to there, and within about 10 seconds, she could have it switched over from one to the next, and about 15 seconds total, I could start playing a track again. So there is a slight lag time, 15 seconds, but it was still enough to take notes and try to hear those differences. Let's go ahead and get started on that. First, I want to get this out of the way. Using just the data side in this fancy LHY switch, I could not tell a difference between that and this. You can come to your own conclusions about that, but to my ears, the tonality, the sound stage, where voices were placed, frequency response, everything, all of that sounded to me indistinguishable between this and the data side only on this LHY. I want to make sure I make that clear. This isn't data side to audio, it's just, again, the data side only, plugging everything into that 2.5 gig section. So with that out of the way, I can set this aside since we're not interested in this anymore. We're going to start looking and talking about how the data side only on this LHY switch compares to the data side plus audio side. So what that tells us is that for the money, this thing is great, especially paired with that linear power supply. I'm going to go ahead and set this aside, and we're going to talk about the LHY audio zone. So before anything, yes, there was a difference between data to data side and data to audio side. And I didn't want to believe it. In fact, being an engineer, I have such a strong belief in confirmation bias, and that if you believe something to be true, your brain is going to make you think that it's true. So the only way that you overcome that is either by doing blind AVX comparisons or having some third party and not telling them that you made any change, or not telling them what the change was, so that they can listen for themselves and come to their own conclusions. The first thing that I noticed when plugging in this switch, first, it runs pretty warm, right? You put your hand on it and it is definitely a warm running switch. So the thermal's on there. It's a good thing that it's a billet aluminum chassis. But the one thing that I noticed immediately switching back and forth between data zone only and then using that SFP, that fiber media converter between the data zone and the audio zone, is that there is an increase in the total soundstage. And what I mean by that is these speakers that I'm using right now, still the lovely Pure Art Fi LS6s, they tend to throw the image back. They don't throw an image in front of the speaker themselves. And that just comes down to the design of the speakers, or so I thought. Switching to this switch in the audio zone, I actually got an increase in the soundstage that just went a little bit in front of the speakers. Instead of being right at the speakers and back, it was like a foot in front of the speakers. So it actually felt like the singers that were singing right up in your face for some of my tracks, they were even more in my face. So they were even closer. It's even a little bit more intimate. And additionally, this room being as narrow as it is, it has issues with soundstage width. And that's why I choose to sit as close to the speakers as I am. It's more of a near field setup sometimes because I want that width still. What this audio zone did is it gave me a little bit of width past those speakers. I was able to close my eyes and very clearly point to drums that are off the right speaker here, listening to Jazz at the Pawn Shop. And yes, in the data zone, it's at the speaker directly. With the audio zone, it is another 1.5 to 2 feet to the right. So it's unreal that was the difference. And my wife called it out as well, that things that were here were now here. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. You know that I care about soundstage tremendously. What I want is a three-dimensional soundstage that has both the correct height for a singer, the correct depth for their voice. If you have someone that's singing and playing a guitar, I want those to be in the same position because sometimes they can be different. Maybe the guitar is further back than the singer, so it kind of gives you the feeling that there's two people instead of one. But in this case, I still had everything that I wanted. I just had a slightly bigger room to work with. The voices and instruments just seemed to move a little bit further apart from each other. It was really interesting to hear that difference. And it's something that, while it is lovely to have, it makes me question of, is this needed for the price? And we're going to get to that in a sec, but I think that's going to be a recurring theme talking about this Switch, is that yes, it's excellent, and yes, it did provide tangible differences, but is it worth $2,500? Because I'm all about getting that value for the dollar. And, maybe your system's at a point where $2,500 is trivial compared to the total cost of the system, but I think for most people, that's not necessarily going to be the case. With those soundstage differences out of the way, so the increased width, the increased depth, the height just a little bit taller but not unrealistically high, was there anything else that I heard? Were there any tonal difference? Was there any frequency response? Yes, actually. And I don't usually touch on this because usually those differences, they're harder to hear, and I think they're more prone to that confirmation bias, which is why I tend to bring up soundstage differences more. Those are much more realistic and much easier to blind ABX or unblind ABX. The differences that I heard was a decrease in the noise floor. And I know that I've talked about that several times, but going from the data zone to the audio zone, there was this eerie blackness that the instruments and the voices just came out of. It seemed like in some of the tracks that I listened to, for example, with Jazz at the Pawn Shop, I've been listening to that a lot lately because there's such a great big open space that it's a great album to use for sound staging. But with the data zone only, you could feel the instruments and the audience in the background firmly rooted where they are, right? You can tell this is exactly where they're at because there's just this noise in the background that you can hear. It's gone in the audio zone. It doesn't exist. So when you get these instruments that are playing and people that are laughing in the background, it seems like they just come out of nowhere. And that eeriness, that ink blackness to the noise floor is really hard to put into perspective until you actually hear it. Need another drink real quick. So with that said, I don't want to give a false impression. Yes, this eerie blackness, this sub-zero noise floor was something to behold using the audio zone, but I don't want you to think that just plugging this switch into your system is going to give you that benefit no matter what. And this is what I mean. You need to have components already that can take advantage of that lower noise floor because your noise floor is only ever as low as your worst component. So if you already are running a tube amp, that already has an inherent noise floor that's going to be higher than most components. And what I mean by that is that my normal monoblocks that I use, my EL84 monoblocks, they sound lovely. They are so realistic, and I just get goosebumps every single time listening to them. But I did not experience the same noise floor drop with them that I did with my Audio A21, which is where I conducted most of my listening. I still got the soundstage increase. That was definitely there with the EL84. But because tubes are inherently noisier than solid-state components, it didn't matter that the switch was quieter. I was still limited by the EL84 monoblocks. And I think that puts into perspective the priorities for a system. Obviously, you don't want hiss coming from your speakers, and you want this jet black noise floor that these voices and instruments can come out of. But there is a point of diminishing returns, and personally, I'm willing to accept that I didn't get that better noise floor using the monoblocks with this switch, because I already love the way that they sound. So what I gained from this was only an increase in soundstage. It's not until I paired this with a solid state component, the lovely Audio A21 with the Audio S5B DAC, that I was able to take advantage of that lower noise floor. If getting this switch is on your mind, if it's something that you're considering, I want you to also consider the components that you're pairing it with. If you already are running something that is fairly noisy, 2 amp for example, I think there are better options than getting this switch. Like, you could just get the fiber media converter by itself, and that's like a little box that LHY sells at $700. You can save yourself $1,800 because that increase in soundstage width, I think, is attributed to the SFP fiber media isolation and not necessarily the switch by itself. But let's not get on a tangent anymore. For the time being, this is going to stay in my system. I do love the way that it sounds, and I love the benefits that I've gotten from it. Do I think it's worth it? The answer is maybe. For me, it would be worth it because there's already enough money invested in the system and the music and everything that, while it's still expensive for me, it's not unsurmountable. It's cheaper than a new turntable. It's cheaper than a new preamp. So with all of that in mind, this is the best upgrade that I could get for the time being. But if your entire system is more reasonably priced, right? You haven't spent $50,000, maybe it's $5,000 on your entire system. I can't say that I would suggest getting the LHY. I would stick with the $15 TP-Link with a linear power supply, because truly, this sounded great to me. And the only difference that I got out of this with the LHY was that bigger soundstage. Yes, the noise floor was lower with these solid-state components, but since I use the EL84 amps about 80% of the time, 70% of the time, I don't get that benefit. So the question just then is that difference worth it to you? But that is a topic for another day. Until then, I will see y'all next time. Cheers.